Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And
Amen.
I may well have done this before, but I was meditating a little bit on this particular bracha, and any kind of bracha like this, where you say asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, who has sanctified us, made us significant through his commandments, but just to realize that what we're doing has more significance to it than simply for its own academic interest. That I think what it tries to say is that there's something just essentially valuable, that we're spending our lives in an essentially valuable way in doing this. And it's trying to help us enjoy this more for that reason. So onwards into the text. So I do believe that there was a Rashi that I skipped yesterday, and because it's an interesting Rashi, and if I did it, please tell me. But this was where it says "Ve'es hasadeh yiten piryo," that the tree of the field will yield its fruit. And the traditional interpretation, the way Rashi quoting the Sifra, says Hein ilanei srak. This is referring to trees that are not fruit bearing. There's a word in Hebrew, srak, which describes trees that do not bear fruit. So in Hebrew culture, there's a distinction made between fruit trees and non-fruit trees. And the point about this blessing is that it's saying that these non-fruit bearing trees, that this Eitz Hasadeh is referring to such trees, va'atidim, and in the future, la'asot peirot, that they will bear fruit in the future. Interesting thing to think about. I was also thinking back on the mention. Remember, we talked about demons and belief in demons. And one thing that I found helpful is that there are reasons for these things. They may not be the given reason, but people don't just cook these things out of their pure imagination. That if people believed in demons or these particular kinds of forces, I guess it would be helpful to understand from a deeper perspective as to why they would have come up with this particular understanding of reality. And I can't explain it better than that at this point. I can only sort of open a door, but it's just so easy to dismiss these things as superstitions. But the point is that there are reasons for people feeling this, just as in the interpretation of fairy stories, there's very often very deep psychological truths that are being expressed, but are being expressed in this sort of literary way. So just another thought back on yesterday's lesson. Here we are. We're going on. So we've had, on condition of observing the Torah, laboring in the Torah, learning the laws and putting those laws into practice, right? And of course, I love to use the metaphor of bringing the Torah down from heaven into this world. So there are going to be all these blessings, and here an additional one, Venatati shalom ba'aretz, and I will place peace in the land. Ushchavtem, you shall lie down, ve'ein macharid, and there is nothing to terrify you, to make you scared. Ve'hishbati chaya ra'ah, and I will cause to cease. So the word Shabbat, which you see in here, means a cessation of some kind. And in the case of Shabbat Bereshit, the Shabbat of Genesis, of creation, we're talking about ceasing labor. That's the point about Shabbat, has to do with cessation. So I will cause the wild beasts, chaya ra'ah, literally it means pernicious beasts, bad beasts, to cease, min haaretz, from the land, v'cherev, and the sword, lo ta'avor ba'artzachem, shall not pass through your land. Here we go. V'natati shalom. So I shall place peace. Shema tomru. So lest you say, or lest you think, hare ma'achal v'hare mishteh, I have food and I have drink, im ein shalom, ein klum. Well, if there's no peace, you can have all that stuff, but it doesn't really count for very much, if at all. Talmud Lomar, and for this reason, Scripture teaches, Hachar calls it, after all that God has promised in terms of prosperity in the land, V'natati shalom ba'aretz, and I shall give peace to the land. Mikan, and from this we can infer, Shehashalom shakul keneged hakol, that peace is equivalent to everything else, to everything. V'chein hu omer, and so it says in Isaiah, I believe, Oseh shalom, he creates peace, he makes peace, uvore et hakol, and creates everything. So you've got shalom on one side and hakol on the other, and just to explain how significant peace is. I will tell you that I have been thinking that in some ways, we've, of course, at least in America, Europe, England, etc., since World War II, have basically experienced peaceful times, certainly in compared to what went on during World War II. And sadly, instead of appreciating that, instead of really deeply understanding what a gift that is, it seems as if we have sort of moved in other directions and perhaps become more self-absorbed than trying to go further and take advantage of what peace provides in terms of a universal, using that as a universal application. And that's not to say everybody. I'm just saying I'm looking at what's going on around us at this particular time, certainly politically, and just really wondering if for some reason we have to endure adversity to appreciate what we have. My mother had a proverb in Yiddish that she used to like, which was, when is the beggar happy? When he finds the object he's lost. So in other words, and of course, the implication is that we're all, in a sense, beggars. And the idea, of course, is that we don't appreciate what we have until we don't have it anymore. So I don't know. I mean, certainly I imagine some of you might want to comment on that. It's just a thought that's gone through my mind.
I do have a one specific kind of question / thought. So when you say that we're living in peacetime, by we, you mean us right here on this?
Yes.
Because, certainly that's not true of a lot of the world.
Yes, that's why I try to limit it to Europe and the United States, that at least North America.
Or at least at least U.S. citizens in terms of global conflicts.
Right.
That we're directly involved with as citizens.
Right. I was trying to be conscious of that, Lauren.
Very narrow.
It is narrow.
Yeah.
But what have we done with it?
Right? I mean, because as the U.S., it doesn't mean we're not involved in conflicts, but is it hurting us, as the ones who are here in a direct everyday way? No, probably not most of us.
Well, certainly in contrast to what was going on in what people were experiencing in World War II. That's sort of the contrast.
Yeah, for us.
For us, yes, absolutely, absolutely. So it went on to say, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's a very rough thought on my part. It's just sort of, in a way, a sad comment on human nature, that as to why, in some ways, why we need adversity. So going on, v'cherev lo ta'avor ba'artzachem, and the sword shall not pass through your land. So notice the phraseology here, how this is being said, because there are lots of ways in which this could have been said. And Rashi picks up again, quoting the Sifra, Ein Sarich Lomar, okay, you don't have to say, in other words, it's obvious, he's saying, Shelo Yavo la Milchama, that they're not going to experience war. Ella, but what this is actually saying is it's going beyond that. And it says, Afilu la'avor derech artzachem. That is to say, even passing through your land, medina la medina. In other words, if a country is waging war against another country, they're not passing through your land in order to wage war. And in other words, the sword passing through your land, even if they're not there to wage war against you. And that's the degree in which they're trying to go this far, that this verse is trying to take it. Uridaftim et oivechem, you shall pursue your enemies, v'naflu lifnechem lecharev, and they will fall before you from the sword. V'radfu mikem, so that you shall, let's see, no, that's the next verse, forgive me. Here it is, lifnechem lacharev, before you by the sword. Ish becherev re'ehu. Interesting. So it seems to be saying here that they are, in other words, speaking about them in the third person, that what Rashi is saying is a man by the sword of his fellow. In other words, you're not going to have to lift up a thing. They're going to destroy each other. They're going to, they themselves are going to destroy each other. So you yourselves won't have to actually do anything. You'll pursue them, but they are going to destroy themselves. So, one moment, please. Okay. Next sentence. V'radfu mikem, and from you will pursue chamisha me'ah. So 5 of you will pursue 100. Ume'ah mikem rivava, and 100 of you 10,000. Your dofu will pursue. V'naflu oivechem lifnechem lacharev. And again it says, and your enemies will fall before you by the sword, So there's we'll take a look at the Rashi on this, and he's saying, wait a second, when you look at the proportions, they don't work out proportionately, but he will say a general statement, and then there appears to be a comment by the editor of this Rashi as to what's going on here. So again, from the Sifra, so v'radfu mikem, they're looking at the mem, right? The mem means of or from. In other words, not all. It's the partitive article, and it means some. In other words, the idea is that some of you will pursue. And he says, here's the min, right? The me in front of a word stands for the word min of hachalashim, the weak shebachem. In other words, from your weak ones amongst you, v'lo min hagiborim shebachem, and not necessarily from the powerful ones of you. In other words, again, trying to take this blessing and tweak it out on the most powerful, the greatest extent that it could be a blessing. So. Chamisha me'ah u'me'ah revava. 5, 100, and 100, 10,000. V'ki kach hu cheshbon. This is again from the Sifra. Is this the way we figure it out? In other words, is this proportionate? V'halo lo hayat tzarich lomar. Shouldn't it have said ela me'a mikem, that 100 of you, shnei alafim, would in fact pursue 2,000. In other words, if 5 pursue 100, 100 would pursue 2,000. That's the proportion. Now, this whole little section here, you see now we go into this parentheses here, and this somewhat lengthy, let me see where it ends, goes on to, it ends right here. It's this lengthy explanation by an editor as to what this is talking about. And it's not easy to really understand, but I will do the best I can with you. So let me just skip it for a moment and finish up the Rashi, and then we can try and dive into it. Ela eino dome mu'atim. The point is this: even though it's not arithmetically proportionate, the truth is that few do not cannot be compared. Sorry, I'm going to finish the phrase. Mu'atim ha'osim et haTorah, that a few people who are practicing the Torah cannot be compared, are not similar, lemerubim ha'osim et haTorah, when a lot of people are performing the Torah. So we're talking about critical mass here. And that's how the Sifra explains the fact that it is not proportional. I'll finish the Rashi. V'naflu oivechem, etc., and your enemies shall fall. Sheyu noflim lifnechem, and again, it means they will fall before you, shelo kederech haaretz, meaning in an unusual way, not in a normal way, that you will have such success against your enemies. Now, let's go into this, see what we can do.
So
Yes.
the you is mostly, it's personal.
Well, it's to the
It's
people.
group and personal, because if you take that, if that 5 of you,
Right,
those 5 who are following the law,
right.
or yes, or those 100 who are following the law. So it
Mhm.
can be not everybody. It
Right,
can be a group, a small group. It can be
right,
individual. It could be anything.
right. I don't know that it necessarily, the fact that it doesn't say 1 and says 5,
Correct.
I think suggests that
Okay.
this kind of blessing, but thank you, Golda, for bringing this out. I really appreciate your doing
Okay.
that.
Thank you.
Of course, is the fact that, I mean, my sense of this, of course, is that as individuals, if we take this seriously, there's something very beautiful being promised to us. But it doesn't mean that it's going to operate on this kind of level. But that at least the good thing is that at least if five are together on practicing the Torah and supporting one another and encouraging one another and learning together and all this kind of thing, that it's quite significant. I mean, very significant. For an individual to do it and be the only one who's doing it would be a very difficult situation. Let me do the best I can with this, and here we go. Yesh medaktakim belashon Rashi. There are those who examine carefully Rashi's language. Shehu kamo kafel v'arichut, which appears to be redundant. Kafel means to double, right? V'arichut, and lengthy. In other words, that the way Rashi expresses this is not necessarily typical of Rashi. And so these people who were examining carefully Rashi's words were wondering why he chose these, why he appears to be redundant, and also why he uses so many words to describe what he wants to describe. Vechi kach hu chacheshbon. In other words, this phrase, they're quoting Rashi, the vechi chach hu chacheshbon. Why would Rashi have to have said, and indeed, is this the proportion, right? I mean, he didn't need to say that, right? V'halo lo haya tzarich lomar. He didn't have to say that at all. So why does he include those words That's what these people are trying to think about. Okay, and in a similar way, medaktakim kol gedulei hamafarshim, all the great commentators also examine carefully, right? V'chashuvehem belashon Rashi. I think here it means the important ones, right? The great and important commentators examine Rashi's language, Parshat Bereshit. Likewise, in the Parsha of Genesis. And again, he says, Lo hayat tzarich. Remember, the very, very first comment Rashi makes is, or it was not the very first, but it's later on in that first comment that Rashi makes on Genesis. Lo hayat tzarich la'atchil. He says, it didn't have to begin. Umatam patach, and going on to say, and for what reason does it start with? Okay. So in other words, this seems redundant and also unnecessary. Shegam ken kafal, because here too he is saying something twice. Let's see. Right. Ve'yein sham, and look carefully. He says he gives a reference to these commentators, be'yishuvam, in their explanation, I believe is what he's saying here. V'chan nira, in other words, back when they talk about Rashi saying these words back in Genesis. V'chan nira lefaresh, all right? And here it appears to explain what's going on here. The Mori Hagaon Hamuflag, he says, to my teacher, the great Gaon scholar. A Gaon is somebody who's an outstanding scholar. Morenu Harav Rav, our teacher, the Rabbi Moshe Charif. His name is Moshe Charif, apparently. Now, I don't know what this abbreviation stands for. Okay, I didn't go to a book of abbreviations to see, but here we are. It's an abbreviation. So again, I don't want to say necessarily. I don't want to guess. Shemilat revava, that the word revava that is used, right? The word revava is which means 10,000. Sovel shnei pirushim, that in fact it accommodates two explanations to this word revava. Pirush echad, so one explanation is aseret alafim, 10,000. And regarding this, maksher Rashi, I know it took me a while to try and figure out what exactly this meant, but clearly it means maksher. In other words, Rashi raises the difficulty. V'chi kach hu hacheshbon, and that's why Rashi raises this question: is this in fact the correct amount? Upiresh sheni, and a second explanation, revava, of the word revava, mispar meruba. It simply means a large number. Al shem ribui, from this noun ribui, like to multiply. V'zeh hapirush sholel Rashi, and this is the explanation that Rashi hangs on to. Be'omro v'halo lo hayat tzarich lomar, when he goes on to say, in fact, he only has to say, v'chule, etc. The dok, and dok means, I believe he says that this is like a QED. In other words, the reason why Rashi says it in these two ways, right, in this repetitive way, is that the first question is questioning the word revava, understanding the word revava as 10,000. And Rashi is rejecting that interpretation of revava. And the reason is, v'halo lo hayat tzarich lomar, using that phrase, is emphasizing the second explanation of revava to mean a large number. and not dafka 10,000. And then the rest of his comment flows. So this is actually a very insightful comment here as we sort of dig deep into how we want to understand this. And I'm going to stop here, and we'll hopefully continue tomorrow. And with this section. So right in there. Very good. I'm going to stop the share. And if any of you have any questions or thoughts about what we just did. Kathleen, do you have a question? You're muted, so we can't hear you.
No, I'm just going over it again in my head.
Okay. I know it was a little complex, but hopefully understandable.
Yes.
When
All right.
they have the curses, are we supposed to whisper those curses silently? Because if we say it out loud, something might happen. Is that right?
I don't think that could be an explanation, Harlan. Okay, so just to give a fuller interpretation of what you just, I believe, are trying to say, is that when you do the public reading of the Torah, right, the Torah reader is supposed to drop his or her voice and go quickly over these words. I think my understanding is more out of respect for the congregation, that because these are such harsh words, you don't want to emphasize them, and you don't want to insult the congregation. So I believe that that's the reason we're doing it that way, and not because we feel that if we say it out loud, it's going to come to be. I don't believe that's the reason. I really do believe it's simply a way of respecting the congregation and being in a holy service and a holy place. And these are people who are willing to come and hear it, and listen to it, etc. So it's a good question, Harlan, because again, there are reasons why people do things. So I'm going to stop the recording. And